It begins with a mother's trembling voice on the phone. "Please, you have to help me. Someone took my bobbies. He carjacked me. He drove off with them inside." The dispatcher tries to calm her down. The words spill out like broken glass, sharp and desperate. "A black man," she says, wearing a knit cap, forced her out of her car and sped away. Inside that car, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex strapped in their car seats. Within hours, Susan Smith's face is everywhere, on local news, then national broadcasts. Cameras capture her tearful eyes, her soft southern voice, the cracks in her words. America is captivated. A young mother crying for her children, 2 little boys missing in the night. But even from the very beginning, something about the story feels off. The details are vague. The emotions, though powerful, seem rehearsed. Could a mother really be making this up? Could she really do the unthinkable? 9 days later, the truth emerges, and it is darker than anyone could have imagined. South Carolina, October 1994. The fall air is cooling, the leaves beginning to turn. Union County is a small place, close-knit, the kind of community where neighbors wave to each other and church bells still matter. When Susan Smith appears on television, begging for the safe return of her boys, the town rallies behind her. She clutches a tissue, dabbing her eyes, voice cracking. "My children wanted me, they needed me. Please, please bring them back." Behind her, the boy's father, David Smith, stands awkwardly, grief etched into his face. But his expression doesn't quite match hers. He looks lost, broken. She looks almost performative. Could it be the nerves of a desperate mother under the spotlight? Or was there something more sinister hiding behind those tears? The nation asks, where are Michael and Alex? Who would kidnap 2 little boys from their mother's car? To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we have to step back into Susan's life before the night of October 25th. Susan Lee Vaughn was born in 1971 in Union, South Carolina. Her childhood was far from stable. Her parents divorced when she was just 7, and her father later took his own life. That wound stayed with her, invisible but heavy, shaping the way she sought love, the way she handled rejection, the way she saw herself in the mirror. As a teenager, Susan attempted suicide herself. Loneliness and sadness were constant shadows. Yet to the outside world she appeared bright, attractive, bubbly. Boys noticed her. Teachers liked her. She learned early how to smile through the pain, how to present an image people wanted to see. At 19, she married David Smith. They were young, reckless, in love, or at least in something that felt like love at the time. Their marriage was troubled from the start. David came from his own difficult background, and the two fought often, split apart, reconciled, and repeated the cycle. Affairs on both sides made things worse. Susan craved affection, validation, attention. David struggled to provide it. But through the turbulence, they had children. Michael, a lively toddler with an impish grin, and Alex, still a baby with chubby cheeks and wide eyes. They were innocent, untouched by the storms swirling in their parents' lives. At least for a little while. By 1994, Susan's marriage was collapsing. She was seeing another man, Tom Findlay, the wealthy son of a local businessman. Tom was attractive, successful, everything David wasn't. But Tom wasn't interested in being a stepfather. He wanted Susan, maybe, but not the baggage of her 2 children. This is where the seeds of tragedy were planted. On October 25, Susan had dinner at a friend's house, then strapped Michael and Alex into their car seats. Instead of driving home, she drove around aimlessly, her mind racing. She ended up at John D. Long Lake, a quiet, dark stretch of water. What happened next is still debated, whether it was premeditated, whether she snapped, whether she believed some twisted fantasy about starting fresh. But what we do know is chilling. She left her sons strapped into their car seats, released the handbrake, and let the car roll into the water. Slowly, the Mazda slid forward, headlights cutting through the dark, then dipping under. The car filled with water, the boys unable to escape. Their small bodies pressed against the straps, their cries swallowed by the lake. It was deliberate, it was final, and it was unforgivable. Yet within minutes, Susan was back in control, rehearsing her lie, calling police with the story of a carjacker. When investigators arrived, Susan described her supposed attacker, a black man wearing dark clothes and a knit cap. He had approached her car at a red light, forced her out, and sped off with the children still inside. The description triggered a frenzy. Police checkpoints sprang up. Sketches were circulated. Black men in Union County were suddenly under suspicion, pulled over, questioned, searched. The community, largely white and conservative, was all too ready to believe Susan's story. But some detectives had doubts almost immediately. Why didn't Susan seem more frantic? Why were her details so vague? Why was her husband acting more distraught than she was? Still, the search expanded. Helicopters scoured fields. Divers checked rivers. Volunteers combed woods. Across the country, people sat glued to their TVs, watching Susan's tear-streaked face begging for her boy's safe return. "Please," she pleaded, her voice trembling, "if you have my children, bring them home. They're all I have." But what the cameras couldn't see was the cold calculation behind those tears. 9 days, that's how long the lie lasted. During those days, Susan played the role of grieving mother to perfection. She held vigils, prayed with pastors, sobbed into reporters' microphones. And yet, cracks widened. She failed a polygraph test. Her timeline didn't add up. Police noticed inconsistencies, little things like where the carjacking supposedly happened or how she described the attacker. Behind closed doors, detectives pressed harder. They sensed something was wrong. And then on November 3, 1994, Susan finally broke. In a written confession, she admitted everything. She drove her car into John D. Long Lake with her sons inside. She let them drown. When divers pulled the car from the water, the scene was almost too much to bear. Inside were the lifeless bodies of Michael and Alex, still strapped into their seats, their small faces frozen in terror. The illusion shattered. America was horrified. The mother who had cried on national TV, who had captured the nation's sympathy, was not a victim. She was the killer. Why? That was the question that haunted everyone. Why would a mother destroy her own children? Prosecutors argued it was selfishness, that Susan wanted freedom, a fresh start, the love of a man who didn't want kids. They painted her as cold, manipulative, heartless. Her defense argued she was mentally ill, depressed, not in her right mind. They pointed to her troubled past, her father's suicide, her own attempts, her emotional instability. But no defense could erase the image of those two small boys strapped in the backseat, slowly sinking under the dark water. And that image is what the jury would never forget: Susan's early life and marriage. The haunting story of Susan Smith cannot be understood without going back to the shadows of her childhood, back to the insecurities that grew with her, and back to the unstable relationships that marked her journey into adulthood. To understand the crime, one must understand the woman. But here, the question viewers still ask: was Susan always destined to do something so terrible, or did a series of tragedies push her over the edge? A childhood of scars. Susan Lee Vaughn was born on September 26, 1971, in Union, South Carolina, a small town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. But behind the warmth of the southern landscape, her early years were fractured by instability and trauma. Her parents' marriage collapsed when she was still young. Divorce tore the family apart, and Susan's father, who battled depression, died by suicide when she was only a teenager. The shadow of that act stayed with her for the rest of her life. Losing a parent in such a devastating way created an emptiness in Susan that she never learned to fill. She sought love, validation, and stability in others, but often found rejection, disappointment, or worse. Could this early trauma have planted the seed for what she would later do? Or was it just one of many factors that made her fragile? Living with secrets. Susan's mother remarried a man named Beverly Russell, a respected figure in the community and a member of the Christian Coalition. Outwardly, their blended family looked picture-perfect, but appearances can be deceiving. Behind closed doors, Susan endured sexual abuse at the hands of her stepfather. Years later, this revelation would become part of her defense narrative, painting a picture of a young girl stripped of safety and trust at the most vulnerable time of her life. She confided in friends about the trauma, but for years the truth was buried beneath layers of silence. The abuse left Susan with profound emotional wounds, one she would struggle with well into adulthood. The teenage Susan. By her teenage years, Susan was already spiraling between extremes, trying to fit in, craving acceptance but battling depression and suicidal thoughts. At age 13, she attempted suicide. At 18, shortly after graduating high school, she tried again. The darkness seemed to follow her no matter where she went. People who knew her in Union described her as pretty, quiet, and polite, but also troubled, someone who always seemed to be carrying a storm beneath her smile. Was this a warning sign of what was to come, or just the tragic path of a girl born into pain she never asked for? Meeting David Smith. In the late 1980s, Susan met David Smith, a young man from Union who came from his own troubled background. David was described as good-hearted but immature, someone who wanted to do the right thing but often found himself making reckless decisions. Susan and David quickly formed a bond, each seeing in the other a chance for love and stability. For Susan, who longed to escape her chaotic family dynamics, David was a way out, a partner who could give her the family she desperately wanted. But the relationship was rocky from the start. They fought, broke up, reunited, and repeated the cycle. Both were unfaithful at times. Both carried emotional baggage that often spilled into their marriage. Yet despite their instability, they married in 1991. Susan was just 19 years old. A marriage full of cracks. Susan and David's marriage was anything but idyllic. Financial stress, jealousy, and infidelity plagued their union. Susan's need for attention and validation often pushed her into other men's arms, while David's immaturity and struggles with responsibility strained their connection. Still, there were good moments. They had 2 children, Michael, born in 1991, and Alexander, known as Alex, born in 1993. Friends and neighbors described Susan as a devoted mother. Photos of her with her boys showed genuine affection, smiles, cuddles, the image of a young mom who adored her kids. But inside, Susan was unraveling. Her affairs with other men, including one with a wealthy local man she desperately wanted to marry, created emotional chaos. She craved a lifestyle beyond what David could provide, and she resented the responsibilities of motherhood that tied her down. It was as if Susan was living 2 lives, one as the mother who tucked her children into bed at night, and another as the restless young woman chasing attention, romance, and escape. Desperate for love. One of the key figures in Susan's double life was Tom Findlay, the son of a wealthy local businessman who owned the textile company where she worked. Susan fell deeply for him, seeing in him the promise of a glamorous future, far away from her small-town struggles. But Tom wasn't interested in becoming a stepfather. In a letter that would later become infamous, he told Susan he could never see a serious future with her because she had children. That rejection cut deep. For Susan, already fragile and desperate, it reinforced the belief that her kids stood in the way of the love and life she wanted. Could this have been the trigger that pushed her to the unthinkable? Susan's battle with herself. By 1994, Susan was in turmoil. She was separated from David at times, entangled in affairs and struggling with her own mental health. Those who knew her recalled her wild mood swings. She could be bubbly and affectionate one moment, withdrawn and bitter the next. She wanted her children but resented them. She loved them but felt trapped. She dreamed of a new life but couldn't break free. This inner conflict simmered like a storm cloud, waiting for the moment it would finally erupt. The question that haunts. Looking back at Susan's early years, the question remains: was Susan Smith always dangerous, or did the pressures of her life drive her to snap? Was she a victim of her own trauma, or was she simply selfish, willing to sacrifice anyone, even her own children, for the life she craved? The truth may lie somewhere in between, but what happened next would forever destroy her carefully constructed image and shatter the lives of two innocent little boys. The fateful night. October 25, 1994, began like any ordinary autumn day in Union, South Carolina. The town was quiet, tucked away in the heart of the South, where neighbors waved at each other, church bells marked the rhythms of the week, and people still left their doors unlocked. It was the kind of place where tragedies were supposed to happen elsewhere, not here. But that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness settled over Union, Susan Smith was making decisions that would horrify the nation. The question that echoes decades later is simple, yet impossible to comprehend. What drives a mother to kill her children? Evening routine, or something more? That night, Susan picked up her boys, Michael, 3 years old, and Alex, 14 months, from daycare. They were happy, energetic toddlers, full of laughter and innocence. Neighbors later remembered seeing Susan and the children together. Nothing seemed unusual. To anyone watching, it looked like a typical young mom out with her boys. But behind Susan's smile, her mind was spinning. She was battling rejection, loneliness, and despair after receiving Tom Findley's letter cutting off their relationship. He had told her he couldn't see a future with her because she had children. For Susan, already fragile, those words burned like fire. Was she angry? Was she heartbroken? Or was she simply desperate to remove the obstacles she believed stood between her and a better life? The drive begins. As night fell, Susan loaded Michael and Alex into her burgundy Mazda protege. Both boys were strapped into their car seats, giggling, completely unaware of the danger ahead. Witnesses later said Susan drove aimlessly for hours that night, circling around Union. She claimed she was clearing her head, but in reality, she was wrestling with a monstrous decision. She later told investigators she considered taking her own life along with the boys, driving into the lake together, ending everything. But in those final moments, she decided differently. John D. Long Lake. Susan eventually drove to a place that locals knew well, John D. Long Lake, a quiet, secluded spot just outside of town. It was dark, the air still, the only sounds the gentle lapping of water and the rustle of trees. This was where Susan's private torment turned into a public nightmare. She parked near the boat ramp, got out of the car, and stood in the cool night air. Her boys were still inside, Michael asking questions, Alex babbling like any toddler. Imagine that moment, two innocent children strapped in their seats, watching their mother's every move. They trusted her completely. The decision. Susan later confessed to what happened next, though her words never fully explained her actions. She released the handbrake, put the car into neutral, and stood outside as the Mazda began rolling slowly toward the water. At first, it crept forward. Then gravity took hold. Michael and Alex were trapped. They cried out as the car picked up speed, heading straight for the black surface of the lake. The car plunged in, headlights cutting briefly through the water before disappearing into darkness. Inside, the boys struggled, but the car was sealed shut. Within moments, it sank below the surface. Susan stood there, watching as her children drowned. It is one of the most haunting images in American true crime history. A mother letting go of her children not out of accident, but by choice. Her initial story. But when Susan drove back into town, She didn't tell anyone the truth. Instead, she concocted a story that would grip the nation. At 9:34 p.m., she ran to a nearby house, frantic, and called 911. She told police that a black man had hijacked her car at a stoplight with her children inside. He had driven off, leaving her behind, screaming for help. Her voice shook as she gave details. She described the supposed carjacker, his clothing, his accent. She cried and begged for help. It sounded believable. It sounded urgent. Police responded immediately. Roadblocks were set up. Helicopters flew overhead. Officers combed the woods and neighborhoods. The people of Union, a close-knit community, rallied to search for the two missing boys. The media frenzy. Within hours, the case exploded across national media. TV crews arrived. Reporters stood on the streets of Union, broadcasting the story of a young mother whose children had been kidnapped by a stranger. Susan played the role of grieving mother perfectly. She sobbed on camera, pleaded for her children's safe return, and delivered emotional appeals to the supposed kidnapper. "Please bring them home," she begged, her voice breaking. "They mean everything to me." Viewers across America felt her pain, or thought they did. Donations poured in. Volunteers searched tirelessly. Strangers prayed for the safe return of Michael and Alex. But underneath the tears and trembling voice, there was no kidnapper, no mystery man, no hope. The truth was already sinking beneath the surface of John D. Long Lake. Questions in the darkness. Even as police scrambled to chase leads, some detectives quietly admitted they had doubts. Why had there been no witnesses at the intersection where Susan claimed the carjacking happened? Why had she run in the opposite direction of where she said the carjacker drove? And perhaps the most haunting question, why did her story change every time she told it? Still, in those first days, the public believed her. America believed her. She was the grieving mother, the victim of a cruel stranger. Only later would the truth emerge, that Susan Smith had scripted the entire performance from the beginning. A nation holding its breath. For 9 long days, the story dominated headlines. Each day, Susan appeared on TV, more emotional than the last. Each day, people prayed harder for the boys. But as investigators dug deeper, cracks began to appear. And when the truth finally came out, it was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The lie that fooled America. The night Susan Smith dialed 911, America was introduced to what looked like a mother's worst nightmare. Her voice trembled, her words cracked with desperation, and she described a terrifying scene. A carjacker had taken her children. On the surface, the story had all the elements of a national tragedy. A young mother, 2 missing bobbies, and a faceless villain. But behind that narrative was something far darker. How long can a lie this big survive under the glare of the entire nation? The birth of the carjacker's story. Susan told police she had been stopped at an intersection when a black man wearing dark clothes and a knit cap forced his way into her Mazda protege. She said he shoved her out of the car and drove off with her sons still strapped into their seats. It was a terrifying image, and it played into fears and stereotypes that many Americans, especially in the 1990s, were quick to believe. The manhunt began immediately. Officers set up roadblocks, combed through neighborhoods, and questioned anyone who fit the vague description Susan gave. But there was a problem. No one had seen anything. Not a single witness reported a car speeding away. No one had seen a struggle. Still, the police had to act on her word, and the media wasted no time broadcasting it. Susan's tearful pleas. Just 24 hours later, Susan appeared on TV. With cameras rolling, she begged the supposed abductor to bring her bobbies home. Her face was streaked with tears. Her voice broke as she said, "My children wanted me, they needed me, and now I can't help them. Please, I can't live without them." The nation was captivated. News anchors replayed her words. People across America wept watching a mother beg for her boy's return. But for investigators watching her closely, some things didn't feel right. Early red flags. Police noticed inconsistencies in Susan's story. She claimed the carjacking happened at a red light, but there were no witnesses in what should have been a busy intersection. She described the suspect vaguely, and her details shifted between interviews. She said she ran to a nearby house to call 911, but her timeline of events didn't add up. Detectives also studied her behavior. While Susan cried in front of cameras, some officers felt her emotions seemed rehearsed, turned on and off like a switch. One investigator later said, "She could cry on cue, but when you looked closely, there weren't always tears." The role of race. The racial element of Susan's lie added another layer of complexity. By accusing an anonymous black man, she tapped into long-standing racial fears in the South. Police had to tread carefully. Her claim couldn't be ignored, but they were also aware of how explosive such an accusation could be. The community, mostly white, reacted predictably. Many were immediately convinced a dangerous black man had invaded their safe town and stolen 2 innocent children. This bias gave Susan's story an unearned credibility and bought her time. A nation on edge. As the search entered its second and third days, the story dominated national news. Helicopters scanned forests, dive teams searched lakes and rivers, volunteers walked through fields holding candles and praying for the boy's return. President Bill Clinton even expressed sympathy, as the case had become headline news across the country. Susan leaned into her role, giving interviews, holding press conferences, and crying before the cameras. Her performance was convincing, so convincing that millions of Americans wept with her. But behind the cameras, detectives were growing restless. The investigators close in. The Union County Sheriff's Office and the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, SLED, began looking harder at Susan herself. Why were there no signs of a struggle on her car? Why had she failed a polygraph test? Why did her story change every time she repeated it? And perhaps most suspicious of all, why was her estranged husband David cooperating fully with investigators, while Susan seemed evasive and defensive? Detectives began tailing her, studying her every move. They noticed she wasn't acting like a grieving mother in private. She was calm, even flirtatious with some of the men around her. Was this the real Susan Smith, slipping through the cracks of her performance? David Smith's pain. Meanwhile, David Smith was living every father's nightmare. He had rushed to Susan's side when she first reported the boys missing. He cried on television, begged for their return, and cooperated fully with police. He believed Susan's story at first. Why wouldn't he? He couldn't imagine that the woman who carried his children would ever harm them. But as time passed, even David began to notice Susan's strange behavior. At one point, she suggested they go on TV together and look like a family again. To him, it felt like she cared more about appearances than finding their sons. His heartbreak was raw and genuine, and it contrasted sharply with the inconsistencies in Susan's story. 9 days of lies. For 9 long days, the nation was gripped by the mystery. Where were Michael and Alex? Who was this mystery carjacker? Could the boys still be alive? People lit candles, prayed in churches, and tied ribbons around trees in hope of the children's safe return. But all along, Susan knew the truth. The boys were not with a stranger. They were not waiting to be rescued. They were gone, drowned in John D. Long Lake, where their little bodies remained trapped inside the car. Every day that passed made the eventual revelation even more horrifying. Cracks in the mask. By the 7th day, detectives had enough doubts to push Susan harder. They questioned her for hours, pressing her on details. Her story shifted under pressure. Why had she driven in circles for hours that night? Why couldn't she recall key details about the supposed abduction? Then came the most telling sign. Investigators realized her timeline of events was impossible. The road she claimed to have driven didn't match the time she said it all happened. Bit by bit, her story unraveled. The turning point. On November 3, 1994, 9 days after the boys disappeared, Susan was brought in for another round of questioning. Detectives laid out the evidence, point by point, showing how her story didn't add up. Finally, after hours of pressure, Susan broke. She confessed, not all at once but in fragments. First, she admitted there was no carjacker. Then she admitted she had driven the car into the lake herself. And with those words, America's image of the grieving mother shattered. A nation betrayed. When the truth came out, the shock was immediate and overwhelming. People who had prayed for her, donated money, and defended her were outraged. The betrayal was personal. How could a mother do this? How could she let her children drown while pretending to search for them? The same cameras that had once broadcast her tearful pleas now captured the fury of a nation. Her name became synonymous with deceit and maternal betrayal. And beneath the surface of John D. Long Lake, divers prepared to recover the car, a heartbreaking task that would reveal the reality of Susan's crime in the most devastating way. The confession and national shock. On the 9th day of the investigation, November 3, 1994, the carefully woven fabric of Susan Smith's life finally tore apart. Detectives had been circling her for days, pressing her with inconsistencies, dissecting every word of her account and scrutinizing her behavior. At last, the pressure broke her. What came out of her mouth didn't just stun the officers in the room, it horrified an entire nation. The breaking point. That afternoon, Susan was at the Union County Sheriff's Office, sitting across from investigators who had grown tired of her shifting story. Sheriff Howard Wells, a seasoned lawman who had trusted his gut throughout the case, leaned across the table and said something that cut through Susan's defenses. "Susan, there was no carjacker was there." For a moment's silence. Then her composure began to crack. She shook her head, tears spilling as she whispered, "No." Step by step, she admitted what detectives had begun to suspect. There had been no kidnapping, no mysterious stranger. She had been alone that night, and it was she who had driven her car into John D. Long Lake with Michael and Alex still strapped inside. The confession. Susan's words chilled investigators to the bone. She explained that on the night of October 25, she drove her children to the lake, parked at the boat ramp, and released the handbrake. The car rolled forward slowly at first, then faster until it plunged into the water. She admitted she stood by and watched as her boys, just 3 years and 14 months old, struggled inside the sinking car. Their small cries were the last sounds they made as the vehicle disappeared beneath the surface. For 9 days, while the entire country prayed for their safe return, Susan knew they were already gone. One investigator later said, "I've heard a lot of confessions in my life, but nothing prepared me for this. The idea that a mother could do that, it still shakes me to this day." The search ends. Within hours of her confession, divers were dispatched to John D. Long Lake. Crowds gathered at the scene, reporters swarmed, and helicopters hovered overhead as the search began. The water was murky and still, the kind of place where secrets could hide, but not for long. As divers descended, they found the car submerged about 30 feet from the ramp, nose down in the silt. Inside, the heartbreaking sight awaited them. Michael and Alex, still strapped into their car seats, their tiny bodies lifeless. The divers carefully brought the car to the surface. The boys were recovered and taken for examination. Even seasoned professionals wept openly that day. Union, South Carolina, was never the same again. A nation's heartbreak. When news of the confession and recovery broke, the shockwaves rippled across America. Just days earlier, millions had cried alongside Susan during her televised pleas. Now those same people felt betrayed, furious, and devastated. The betrayal was personal. It wasn't just that Susan had killed her children. It was that she had deceived the entire country, manipulating their sympathy with crocodile tears. Editorials raged. Talk shows erupted. Churches held vigils not for the mother anymore, but for the innocent boys she had drowned. America's tears turned into anger overnight, one journalist recalled. David Smith's anguish. For David Smith, the boy's father, the news was unbearable. He had believed Susan, defended her, and prayed desperately for the safe return of Michael and Alex. Now he had to face the unimaginable truth. The mother of his children had murdered them. At the funeral, David sobbed uncontrollably, leaning over the tiny coffins of his sons. Friends held him upright as he spoke words no father should ever have to say. "I will never understand why," he said through tears, "but I will always love my boys, and I will carry them in my heart forever." His grief became a defining image of the case, the raw, unfiltered pain of a man robbed of his family. Media frenzy. The story exploded across every television channel and newspaper front page. Susan Smith's face became infamous overnight, not as a grieving mother, but as the woman who had killed her children and lied about it. Headlines screamed, "The mom who lied to America." Susan Smith confesses, boys drowned in lake. From victim to villain. The public's outrage was relentless. People who had once sent Susan letters of sympathy now sent her hate mail. Strangers spit at her name. How could she have stood before cameras, pleading for her sons' lives, knowing they were dead because of her? Motives questioned. In the days after her confession, investigators searched for answers. Why did Susan do it? Theories swirled. Many pointed to her affair with Tom Findlay, the wealthy local man who had rejected her because she had children. Did she believe that without the boys, she could have a future with him? Others cited her depression, her history of suicide attempts, and her mental instability. Perhaps she had been consumed by hopelessness and made a reckless, irreversible decision. But to the public, these explanations felt hollow. Nothing could justify a mother choosing to kill her children. Susan behind bars. After her confession, Susan was placed in custody at the Union County Jail. She was kept under suicide watch, as authorities feared she might attempt to take her own life. Her demeanor shifted between tears and calmness, between remorse and defensiveness. Some guards said she seemed relieved the truth was out, as if the burden of maintaining her lie had finally broken her. Still, her actions had already destroyed countless lives. The larger conversation. Beyond Union, the Susan Smith case sparked national debates about motherhood, mental health, and race. Motherhood, how could a woman who had seemed like a devoted mother commit such a crime? Was it selfishness, or was she too mentally ill to see reality clearly? Mental health. Should her depression and trauma excuse her or condemn her further? Race. By inventing a black carjacker, Susan had exploited racial prejudice, furthering dangerous stereotypes and wasting police resources in minority communities. The case wasn't just about one family anymore. It had become a mirror reflecting America's deepest fears and divisions. The haunting question. In the aftermath of the confession, one question refused to fade. What did those final moments feel like for Michael and Alex? Michael, at 3 years old, was old enough to sense danger. Did he cry out for his mother as the car rolled forward? Did Alex, still a baby, cry in confusion, unaware of what was happening? The thought was unbearable, and yet it haunted millions. Those who had once prayed for the boys' safe return now prayed for their peace in death. A nation shattered. By the time the car was pulled from John D. Long Lake, Susan Smith was no longer a mother searching for her children. She was a murderer. a deceiver, and a symbol of betrayal. Her confession marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, the trial that would determine her fate. But for the people of Union, and for millions who watched from afar, the damage was already done. 2 boys were gone forever, and the world would never forget the mother who put them in the water. The trial and sentencing. The trial of Susan Smith in the summer of 1995 was one of the most highly publicized court cases of the decade. For 9 months, the world had waited to see what justice would look like for a mother who drowned her own children. By the time jury selection began, the story had already been dissected in every newspaper, on every TV network, and in endless public debates. The courtroom in Union County was no longer just a local stage. It was a national theater, with the whole country watching. The charges. Prosecutors charged Susan Smith with 2 counts of murder for the deaths of Michael and Alex. Because of the brutality of the act and her deliberate deception afterward, the state sought the death penalty. For many, this seemed fitting. After all, how could a mother who rolled her children into a lake deserve anything less? But the defense team was determined to show another side of Susan, one they hoped would move the jury toward mercy. The defense strategy. Susan's attorneys, led by David Bruck and Judy Clark, were experienced in death penalty cases. They knew their client's chances were slim, given the overwhelming evidence and her own confession. So they didn't argue innocence. Instead, they focused on mitigation, painting Susan not as a monster but as a deeply broken woman. They told the jury about her troubled childhood, her father's suicide, her history of depression, and the sexual abuse she endured as a teenager. They described a woman overwhelmed by rejection, mental illness, and hopelessness. "She is not evil," Bruck said during opening arguments. "She is sick, and she needs your compassion, not your condemnation." Their goal wasn't to win acquittal. It was to save Susan from the electric chair. The prosecution's case. On the other side, prosecutor Tommy Pope painted a far different picture. He described Susan as a manipulative, selfish woman who valued her love life more than her children's lives. He emphasized her obsession with Tom Findlay, the man who had rejected her, and suggested she killed her sons to remove what she saw as obstacles to a new relationship. "The boys were in the way," Pope told the jury. "She wanted a new life, and the only way to get it was to get rid of her children." The prosecution called witnesses to show Susan's calmness during the 9 days of lies, her repeated public appeals, and the cold calculation of her actions at the lake. This was not an accident, Pope argued. It was murder, and it cries out for the ultimate punishment. The evidence. Jurors listened to hours of testimony, but the most damning evidence was Susan's own confession. Her written statement was read aloud in court. The words, simple, haunting, described how she had let the car roll into the lake and stood by while her sons drowned. Jurors wiped tears from their eyes. Even reporters in the room admitted to crying as the details unfolded. The prosecution also presented testimony from divers and first responders, describing the heartbreaking scene when the car was pulled from the water. One diver's words stayed with the jury. "I'll never forget the sight of those boys, still in their car seats. It was the hardest thing I've ever done." The emotional testimony. The most powerful witness was David Smith, the boys' father. Called by the prosecution, he described his sons with tenderness, recalling their laughter, their playfulness, their innocence. When asked about their deaths, David broke down. His grief filled the courtroom, forcing even hardened jurors to wipe away tears. "I trusted her," he said, his voice cracking. "I trusted her with our children, and she took them from me." His testimony reinforced what the prosecution wanted the jury to feel. This was not just a crime. It was a betrayal of the most sacred trust. Susan on the stand. In a controversial move, Susan's defense team put her on the stand. Her testimony was emotional. She described her depression, her loneliness, her feelings of rejection by Tom Findlay, and her desperation that night at the lake. She claimed she hadn't planned to kill her boys but had been consumed by hopelessness and panic. "I loved my children," she said, sobbing. "I didn't want to hurt them, I was just so lost. I wasn't thinking right." The prosecution, however, dismantled her narrative during cross-examination. They pressed her on the 9 days of lies, the television appearances, and the deliberate way she fabricated the story of the carjacker. "If you loved your children, why did you lie to America?" Prosecutor Pope demanded. Susan had no good answer. Public outrage. Outside the courtroom, the public's anger was boiling. Crowds gathered daily, many holding signs demanding the death penalty. Some yelled insults as Susan was brought in and out of the courthouse. The media amplified every detail, from Susan's outfits to her tears, dissecting whether she was truly remorseful or just performing. For much of America, she had already been judged: guilty, manipulative, unworthy of sympathy. Closing arguments. After weeks of testimony, the trial came down to closing arguments. Prosecutor Tommy Pope thundered before the jury. "She strapped those bobbies into that car, drove to that lake, and let them die. This was no accident. This was murder, and it deserves the ultimate price." Defense attorney Judy Clark, in contrast, pleaded for mercy. "Do not answer tragedy with more tragedy. Susan is a damaged soul who acted out of despair, not malice. Killing her will not bring back Michael and Alex." The jury now held Susan's fate in their hands. The verdict. On July 22, 1995, the jury returned its decision. Susan Smith was found guilty of murder on both counts. The courtroom erupted with emotion, some in relief, others in tears. David Smith held his head in his hands, weeping as the verdict was read. But the question remained: would she live or would she die? The sentencing phase. In the sentencing phase, the jury had to decide between life in prison or the death penalty. The prosecution repeated their call for execution, emphasizing the coldness of the crime. But the defense presented more testimony about Susan's mental health, her abuse as a child, and her fragile emotional state. Psychologists testified that Susan suffered from depression and borderline personality disorder. Her family begged the jury to spare her life. After deliberation, the jury returned with its sentence: life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Susan Smith would not face the electric chair. Reactions to the sentence. The decision divided the public. Some believed justice had been served, that life in prison was a fate worse than death for a woman who had to live with her guilt every day. Others were furious, insisting she had deserved the death penalty. Call-in shows and newspaper editorials buzzed with debate. Was the jury too lenient, or had they shown humanity? For David Smith, the sentence brought little comfort. His boys were still gone, and nothing the court decided could change that. Susan in prison. After sentencing, Susan was transferred to the South Carolina Department of Corrections. She was housed at the Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, where she remains to this day. Her life behind bars has been marked by controversies, accusations of affairs with prison guards, discipline issues, and mental health struggles. But in 1995, the focus was still on the fresh wound she had carved into her community and her nation. The legacy of the trial. The trial of Susan Smith became a landmark in American legal and cultural history. Legal scholars debated the use of childhood trauma and mental illness in capital cases. Sociologists studied the public's reaction, particularly the fury directed at Susan as a mother. Race relations experts analyzed the damage done by her fabricated story of a black carjacker. For years to come, her case would be cited in textbooks, classrooms, and courtrooms. A community in mourning. Union, South Carolina, struggled to move on. The lake where Michael and Alex drowned became a painful symbol. Some residents refused to drive past it. Others built memorials to the boys, determined that their short lives would not be forgotten. At the boys' graves, people left toys, flowers, and handwritten notes. Strangers from across the country sent letters of condolence to David Smith, offering prayers for his healing. The community had lost not only 2 children, but also its sense of innocence. A closing chapter. By the end of the trial, the nation's obsession with the case began to fade, but the questions it raised never truly disappeared. What drives a mother to kill her children? Could anyone have stopped Susan before it was too late? And what does justice look like in the face of such tragedy? For Susan Smith, justice meant spending the rest of her life in prison. For Michael and Alex, it meant only that their story would be remembered, their names forever tied to one of America's most infamous crimes. The aftermath and legacy. When the trial ended in July 1995, the cameras finally left Union, South Carolina. The reporters packed their bags, the courtroom fell silent, and the country turned its attention to the next scandal, the next crime, the next headline. But for the people most affected, the story was far from over. The echoes of Susan Smith's crime continued to reverberate through her small town, across the nation, and inside the prison walls where she began her life sentence. Susan Smith behind bars. After sentencing, Susan was sent to the Leath Correctional Institution, a women's prison in Greenwood, South Carolina. For a woman who had lived much of her life in chaos, prison provided structure, but it also brought scrutiny. Susan wasn't just any inmate. She was the woman who had drowned her children. Everyone knew her name, her face, and her crime. At first, Susan struggled with the transition. Guards reported that she cried often, that she seemed fragile, and that she was the target of insults from other prisoners. But as the months turned to years, Susan's prison life grew more complicated. In 2000, reports surfaced that she had sexual relationships with prison guards, leading to charges against the officers. The scandal reignited public outrage. For many, it was proof that Susan remained manipulative, still finding ways to bend others to her will. Later, she faced discipline for drug use and self-harm. These incidents painted a picture of a woman still deeply troubled, still battling the demons that had haunted her long before the night of October 25, 1994. The parole question. Because Susan was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 30 years, she became eligible for parole in 2025. That date has loomed large in public discussion. Should Susan Smith ever walk free again? Could a woman who drowned her children ever be trusted outside prison walls? Victims' rights groups and members of the public have consistently voiced strong opposition. Every few years, as parole approached, new articles and debates reignited the anger of 1994. For many Americans, parole isn't just a legal question, it's a moral one. David Smith's journey. While Susan lived behind bars, David Smith faced the harder task, living free in a world without his sons. In the years after the trial, David struggled with depression, addiction, and grief. He admitted in interviews that he often drank heavily, that he couldn't escape the memories of Michael and Alex. Yet he also tried to rebuild. He remarried twice, fathered more children, and worked to find stability. But tragedy followed him. In 2009, his second son from a later relationship died at age 9, another devastating loss. Despite his struggles, David remained the most human face of the case. In interviews, he often spoke not of Susan but of Michael and Alex, their laughter, their joy, their innocence. His pain was evident, but so was his determination to keep their memory alive. The community's wounds. Union, South Carolina, was never the same. Before October 1994, it was a quiet mill town where crime was rare and people trusted one another. After Susan's crime, that trust was shattered. The racial implications of her fabricated story, that a black carjacker had kidnapped her children, also left deep scars. For 9 days, police and residents chased a phantom suspect, fueling racial tensions in a region with a long history of division. Many black residents of Union have spoken of the fear and suspicion they endured during those days, knowing Susan's lie could have put innocent men in danger. For them, the story was not just about a mother's crime, but about America's quickness to believe the worst when race was involved. Media and public obsession. Even after the trial, Susan Smith's story never fully disappeared from the spotlight. Books were written, including coverage by journalists who followed the case from the beginning. Documentaries revisited the crime, analyzing Susan's mental state, her motives, and the public's reaction. Talk shows debated whether she was a villain, a victim of mental illness, or both. The story resurfaced in 2010 with the release of We Need to Talk About Kevin, a film about a mother struggling with guilt over her child's violence. Critics drew comparisons to Susan Smith, reflecting how deeply her case had embedded itself in American consciousness. In 2020, as true crime surged in popularity, her case appeared again in docuseries exploring infamous mothers who killed. Each time, the reaction was the same: disbelief, anger, heartbreak. Mothers who kill. One reason Susan's story never faded is that it cut against one of the deepest instincts of human nature, the bond between mother and child. Society is horrified by fathers who kill, by strangers who kill, by predators who kill. But when a mother kills, it feels like the ultimate betrayal. Susan Smith became the face of that betrayal. She was the mother who didn't protect, the mother who lied, the mother who watched as her children died. Her case forced America to confront uncomfortable questions. Are some people simply too broken to love, even their own children? Can mental illness ever explain, if not excuse, the unthinkable? And if Susan Smith could do this, could anyone? The symbol of the lake. John D. Long Lake, once just another quiet body of water in Union County, became a symbol of horror. In the years after the murders, people came to the lake to see the spot where the car sank. Some brought flowers or toys for Michael and Alex. Others came out of morbid curiosity. Eventually, local leaders decided to remove the boat ramp where Susan had rolled the car into the water. They hoped to discourage the steady stream of visitors and allow the community to heal. But for those who knew the story, the lake could never be ordinary again. It was forever tied to tragedy. The legacy in true crime. Today, the Susan Smith case is remembered as one of the most infamous crimes of the 1990s. It stands alongside the Menendez brothers, O.J. Simpson, and John Benet Ramsey as a case that defined a decade of sensational trials. But it also occupies a special place in true crime history. It is not just a story of murder. It is a story of deception, of betrayal, of a nation's misplaced sympathy. For 9 days, America cried with Susan Smith. They believed her tears, shared her pain, and prayed for her children's safe return. When the truth came out, the sense of betrayal magnified the horror of her crime. It wasn't just that she killed her sons. It was that she made the entire nation grieve with her. The ongoing debate. Nearly 30 years later, people still debate Susan's motives. Was she driven purely by selfishness, wanting freedom from the responsibility of motherhood? Or was she acting out of deep mental illness and despair? The truth may be a combination of both. But regardless of motive, the outcome remains the same. 2 innocent boys lost, a family shattered, and a community scarred. And for many, that's all that matters. A mother's legacy. Susan Smith will always be remembered not for who she was, but for what she did. For some, she is a cautionary tale about untreated mental illness. For others, she is simply evil, a woman who chose herself over her children. For Michael and Alex, though, she is their mother, the one person meant to protect them, and the one who ended their lives. A nation still asking why. As the years pass, the questions remain. Why did Susan Smith kill her sons? Could anyone have stopped her? Did the system fail her, or did she fail everyone else? These questions may never have satisfying answers, but they continue to haunt the people who lived through the case and the millions who have learned about it since. Toward the final chapter. By the end of the 1990s, Susan's case had already become legend, but her story was not finished. Life in prison is its own long sentence, and the debate over her parole and over what her case says about America was still to come. And so, even decades later, the story of Susan Smith and her two little boys was not over. It lingered, like the ripples in John D. Long Lake, the legacy and modern reflections. Nearly 3 decades have passed since Susan Smith strapped her two little boys into their car seats and let them sink beneath the waters of John D. Long Lake. Yet even now, the case refuses to fade into history. It lingers, on TV screens, in true crime podcasts, in books, and in heated debates whenever her name resurfaces in the news. Susan's crime was not just another murder. It was an act that shattered some of society's most deeply held beliefs, that mothers protect their children at all costs, that grief is genuine, and that the bond of family is sacred. When those beliefs were betrayed, the wound never fully healed. Susan Smith life in prison. Since 1995, Susan Smith has lived inside the Leath Correctional Institution in Greenwood, South Carolina. She entered prison as a 23-year-old and is now in her 50s, having spent most of her adult life behind bars. Her time in prison has been anything but quiet. Over the years, she has been disciplined for drug use, self-harm, and inappropriate relationships with prison guards. In 2000, 2 officers were charged for having sex with her, an abuse of power that once again drew national headlines. These scandals only reinforced the public's view of Susan as manipulative, unable to stay out of trouble, even in a controlled environment. Yet prison records also show moments of compliance and attempts to build a stable routine. Susan has worked in prison jobs, attended counseling, and written letters expressing remorse. But for many, her words mean little compared to the image of 2 tiny coffins lowered into the ground in 1994. The parole question. The most debated issue today is Susan's eligibility for parole in 2025. By law, she will have served the minimum 30 years required before parole consideration. But the decision lies with the parole board and with the court of public opinion. For years, victims, rights groups, and members of the community have vowed to oppose her release. They argue that Susan forfeited her right to freedom the night she drowned Michael and Alex. They say no amount of time, no amount of therapy, could ever make her safe or deserving of another chance. On the other hand, some argue that parole exists for a reason, that people can change, even after terrible crimes. If Susan has truly transformed during her decades in prison, should she not at least be considered for release? The debate is fierce, and every time Susan's name appears in headlines, the anger of 1994 comes rushing back. David Smith stand. No voice carries more weight in this debate than that of David Smith, the father of Michael and Alex. David has said repeatedly that he will fight against Susan's parole. In interviews, he has described the unimaginable pain of losing his boys and the betrayal of discovering that the woman he trusted most was the one who killed them. Michael and Alex don't get a second chance, David once said, so why should she? His words echo the feelings of many Americans who believe that Susan's crime was too great to ever forgive. The case in popular culture. The Susan Smith case has been retold countless times, each version reshaping how new audiences understand the crime. Books such as Sins of the Mother and Beyond All Reason chronicled her life, her lies, and her trial. TV documentaries have examined the case in detail, often focusing on Susan's emotional TV appeals and the national outrage after her confession. Podcasts and true crime channels continue to revisit the story, often asking the same haunting question: why? Her case also influenced broader conversations in media and society. The image of a mother crying on television while secretly guilty became a cautionary tale about public sympathy, media trust, and the hidden darkness that can exist in ordinary lives. A case that changed America. The Susan Smith murders had ripple effects beyond one family, one town, or one courtroom. They changed the way America looked at crime, grief, and motherhood. Race and lies. By inventing a black carjacker as the culprit, Susan exploited racial stereotypes. For 9 days, innocent black men in Union County lived under suspicion. This aspect of the case remains a disturbing reminder of how easily racial prejudice can be weaponized. Mothers Who Kill. Susan became the modern face of maternal filicide, a crime as old as history but rarely discussed. Her case forced experts to study why some mothers kill, whether from mental illness, desperation, or selfishness. The power of media. The 9 days of deception showed how quickly the media and the public could be manipulated by a good story and a tearful face. It became a lesson in skepticism, reminding reporters to dig deeper before amplifying narratives. True crime fascination. The case foreshadowed the explosion of true crime as entertainment. The mix of mystery, betrayal, and shocking confession made it one of the most unforgettable cases of the 1990s. A haunting legacy. For all the analysis, one truth remained simple. 2 little boys, Michael and Alex, lost their lives before they had barely begun to live. Michael was 3, playful and curious. Alex was just 14 months old, still learning to walk, still babbling his first words. Their futures were stolen by the